Whenever I speak to audiences about the Middle East, sometimes audiences very hostile to Israel, I issue one challenge. Name a single country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those threats faced by Israel that has ever had a better record of human rights, a better record of concern for civilians, a better record of sensitivity toward legal issues and the rule of law. In 100 speeches in which I've issued that challenge, no one has ever come up with the name of a country that has a better record than Israel faced with comparable threats. Now, if that's true, how come there have been more resolutions condemning Israel at the United Nations, at the Human Rights Councils, at various human rights organizations? Why have there been more resolutions directed against the best country than the worst countries? That doesn't reflect on Israel. That reflects on the sorry nature of human rights in the world today. Rene Cassin, Eleanor Roosevelt, the people who formulated human rights are turning over in their grave by the way in which the human rights agenda has been hijacked by some of the worst human rights offenders to exculpate and prevent themselves from being prosecuted by turning false attention to Israel. If only the rest of the world has as good a human rights record as Israel has had since its creation over the last 63 years, we would be a much more peaceful world. We would have less need for aggressive human rights organizations. In 1940s, we said never again. And the tragedy is what we've seen instead all over the world has been again and again and again in Darfur, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in the former Yugoslavia, again and again and again. And what has the world done? It's condemned Israel. Consider 1975. Cambodia was murdering between 2 and 3 million innocent people. What was the UN debating? Zionism is a form of racism. There wasn't a single resolution in the UN regarding Cambodia during the genocides. The same thing was true in the 1990s. The same thing was true in the first decade of the 21st century. So when we celebrate human rights, we have to look at all the human wrongs in the world, because human rights should be a reaction to human wrongs. And what we've seen instead is that the human rights agenda has been hijacked by those who perpetuate human wrongs. And the victims, the real victims, have not been Israel. Israel can deal with its problems and defend itself. The real victims have been the 6 million people who have been killed since we said never again in preventable genocides, because human rights, which should be directed against those kinds of genocides, instead is always focused on the one nation that has the best human rights record in the world when faced with comparable threats. Israelis ought to be proud of their record. They ought to improve it. Nobody's perfect. Nobody has a perfect human rights record. But all human rights have to be viewed comparatively. And so as we look to human rights and celebrate them, I think one has to look to Israel as a model and has to look at the United Nations and other organizations as a model of what not to do, how not to respond to the problems of the world today.